Hey everybody, Wayne Dorban, Mark Shepard, Mark from Bangladesh. I think Deb's on with us also helping out at Bar Farm and Ranch. I'm in Berthoud at our cool little office. It was an unbelievably beautiful day today. So nice that instead of doing indoor work that I would normally do, one, I got to take a really cool couple across and do a tour. They've got a farm in southern Virginia that is going to we're going to put a bunch of Mark's principles of forced ecology in play on. And then second, I built a building today, or a portion of one. We've done some of it. And it's actually I never know quite what to call them, but it's a fabric greenhouse type of building with framing. I wanted to get it up before winter, and I've got some extra help right now, so we did that. But oh man, it was gorgeous, probably 75, 78 degrees. The time when it feels really good to be an outdoor farmer and have that opportunity. So we've got Mark here tonight, and he's going to tell us a little bit about his health situation to get started. But I want to announce just one thing, two things actually. One, he's going to do an amazing webinar tomorrow with Raleigh Latham and Neil Spackman's Sustainable Design Masterclass. You got a notice of that in your announcements. So you can go on your EAT site and just go click up in the right-hand corner, and it says announcements, and you can find out all the details of that. Don't inundate me with emails, but I don't mind. If you just can't find a link, send it to me, and I'll get you the link for it. But again, the replays will be available here. Mark's going to talk about unique stuff. It won't be what he's talking about here directly. There'll be some overlap, obviously. You guys are going to be the graduate students there. Anyway, that's tomorrow. One other announcement. Starting Monday next week, I can't remember whether I scheduled it either right before or right after I do the aquaculture session for the week. I think if I remember right, it was after, 15 minutes after it's done, so I think it would be at 7:15 Mountain Time. We're going to start doing a weekly session where it's just you guys. No teaching, it's questions and answers. If you have questions for Mark, he may or may not be on there. I actually don't expect he will be very often, but I'll be accumulating them. I will get them to him. If it's for other speakers when you're not able to be on, it's just you. And I want you to come on. I'm going to open up the mics to you guys if you want to have them. You should talk about your projects. You should network. It's the time that I'm going to do announcements, so I'm not going to be doing announcements on everybody else's webinars and taking time away from Mark and others. So I'll only make this announcement right now. Also, I'll be sending a written announcement out to you. So that said, I'm going to turn it over to Mark. It's all yours, man. Go for it.
All right. Well, since you hinted at it, I'll talk a little bit about what I've recently discovered. Those of you guys who were here last week knew that I was being flown back home for emergency lookup on my left leg, on my thigh. Those of you who've been here a real long time remember back, I think it was in early September, when I slipped and hurt my leg really bad. The doctor said it was fine, keep using it, whatever. Well, it ends up being that I almost completely severed the tendon that connects the largest quadriceps muscles to the kneecap. But what was unique about it is I didn't sever it clean across like is most common, but the back part of it severed, removed from the bone and from the kneecap, and then whenever I'd flex my muscle, it'd bunch up inside my leg. And the range of options go from everything like, oh, it'll be okay. They got me on some pretty amazing muscle relaxants. It'll heal itself and connect itself back up. That's the ideal situation, no pain. Whereas the worst case scenario is to split me from my kneecap right up the front of the thigh all the way up to the groin, then split my thigh in half and reach underneath and start putting everything back together again from underneath, and then sew their way back out again. Piece of cake, they say. So that's kind of been on my mind and occupying me the past couple of days. And then I kind of wanted to start tonight addressing Ray was one of the person's questions, and then another person with questions last week. It seemed to me afterwards when I was driving home that others might have taken my answers to be a little glib, but they weren't. The question is like, well, what do you do? Well, what's your something like, what's your opinion on steep land, Mark? And I said, well, steep land is like this, up to down, and flat land is like that. And I didn't intend to be insulting or anything like that, but basically that's just the physiography of your place, and we have to either adapt to it or forever spend time and money and effort trying to correct some sort of problem, which is not a problem. It's just the place is steep. That's that. Another question was, well, what if none of the species on my place are economic, or will take more than my lifetime to be economic? And I said, well, that's, then there's something that has been missed in how I'm presenting things, because every landscape has the biological legacies in place that are telling us how to interact with it on the most sustainable long-term way. And if there are no species immediately harvested out of that system because they have longer time horizons before their seeds are ready, or their fruit is ready, or seedlings or cuttings or grafts, then we do the agroforestry techniques, which are cash flowing or cash cropping something in between, or grazing animals in between our perennial system to cash flow through time. Then another question was concerning my site is about 90% long-leaved plantain. What does that mean? I said, well, what it means is that your site is about 90% long-leaf plantain. Once again, I didn't mean to be glib. Is the question, I don't know if the question, well, from my perspective, the question is not asked from how I see the world. It's not from the ecological perspective. It seems like it was asked more like a gardening how-to question. And to me, as an ecologist, the fact that it is all longleaf plantain means that somehow the site conditions, there was some sort of disturbance, whether it was, compaction, water, mudslide, chemical change, abandoned field, whatever. That's one factor. There was some sort of disturbance. Another factor is that the conditions were right for the sprouting of certain kinds of seed and not other kinds of seed. And then another factor that depends on is what kind of seed was around it at the time, and how did that seed get delivered to the particular location. That's how I think, instead of saying, oh, it means that you have compaction and you need this, that, or the other thing. That's not how I roll. I'm an ecologist, and I think about things through an ecological perspective. And so if it was long-leaf plantain, I'd figure out how to sell that some kind of medicinal herb company, or feed it to livestock, or juice it. I'm going to shut this door because there's noise downstairs. There's some way to have that not be an issue. Top seed with grasses and graze it and so on. It can be worked with. Anyways, we're going to start tonight. Bill Mollison. There's only one solution, and we have to do it. And this is what I'm all about. Turn all of our resources to repairing the natural world, and train our young people to help. Our aim is to create systems that are ecologically sound and economically profitable. Permaculture and restoration agriculture. We're going to redesign agriculture in nature's image. That doesn't mean try to force nature to conform to some concept of what we had or read in a book, but how do we adapt our agriculture to nature, and then how do we meet in the middle so it's kind of a more natural agriculture and a more agricultural nature. We've been talking about succession, disturbance prior to this, and now succession, the change in plant communities through time on a site. Also means the change in animal communities on a site through the time. Certain kind of animals that are more adapted to open fields with grasses and weeds. Others are more adapted to shrubby young forests. Some are more adapted to climax old growth forests. There are certain species animal species that can only tolerate closed canopy, long-term old growth, undisturbed forest. There's some species that can only tolerate this, and a whole host in between. Ecological succession is the change of species composition over time, or the replacement of one type of plant communities, animal communities with others. It includes the soil. As you go from one type of site, whether it's mud that's been deposited by a flood or a landslide or the toe of a glacier or abandoned cropland or an old pasture, as that site changes through time, the soil biota changes, the above ground plant life changes, the animal life changes. How the biomass is accumulated, where the biomass is stored, and the nutrient cycling in the system. It's all affected by the change in life communities through times, and it never stops, keeps going on and on and on. This goes to illustrate, just want to show, this is with woodcock, which is kind of a shrubland. I actually saw one the other night. It's a funny little bird, kind of like pear-shaped with a big, long snout they'd use for, poking insects and nowadays worms out of the ground. In primary succession is ecosystem change. It starts on previously unvegetated terrain. This rock in Lake Superior was previously unvegetated. It's all just been a bare rock, and it's slowly coming back, beginning with lichens, and the different colors of lichen are actually a different elevation from the water and a different number of years in sequence. We'll talk about that later when we talk more in primary succession. A little spilled pile of hay and debris on a slab of concrete. This is the primary succession process. Hey, that blank green slide is probably going to go through some sort of succession and turn into another slide. I wonder what that was. And we'll talk, like I said, we'll cover primary succession later. Now, secondary succession is community change following disturbance. This, of course, is the wave-generated fir, where the oldest, most brittle trees snap in the prevailing winds, and then the younger trees grow up underneath it. There's open grass exposed. There's pit and mound architecture with the root ball. I forgot what. All right, what's going on with my slides?
Don't I see it's back.
Everything just dropped dead right there.
Yeah, I see. I'm not sure what happened there. That's weird.
You know what it is? I'm gonna.
Oh no, it's back. You're back there. So.
You know what I'm gonna do though is I'm gonna kill my. It won't even let me kill my film because that's what it was before. Is that the when my camera was on, it did not appreciate it. Am I here?
Yep, you're there. You're back on.
There we go. Now I got this slide. Primary succession. I took this picture, believe it or not, on my way to the Republican National Convention in Cleveland, Ohio, earlier this summer. It's a long story as to why I was there, but I was getting my car engine fixed. There were wild strawberries climbing out onto the sidewalk. One of the first species to invade an obviously hostile territory, with thousands of Republicans walking on it daily. All right, so blowdown, wind is a major disturbance. Fire is a major disturbance. Agriculture is a major disturbance. There's already used to be an ecosystem in place. Formerly in this region, this is southwest Wisconsin, it was oak savanna and northern hardwoods that got cleared for prairies and grasslands that got plowed to turn into corn and beans and alfalfa to get exposed to the wind and the rain, to wash into the streams. We had 2.5 inches of rain last night. Now, how does succession work? This is the stuff that really I kind of get off on. Read through this as we go, and I'm going to try to explain what's so awesome about it. It's like you're working with 75,000 different colors of clay, and we have things with different life cycles. Some grow fast, some grow slow, some take 3 years, 5 years, 10 years. It's a function of an interaction of multitudes of different species with radically different life histories and different regeneration and survival strategies, and they're all determined somewhat genetically by the plants. And there's almost limitless possibilities for the differences between the species in their requirements for regeneration. And there's a number of different ways that one plant community can replace another plant community, almost unlimited varieties of ways. And what's interesting is these life history traits and genetic adaptations, they're actually selected for by the site conditions. And so the site conditions kind of determine what happens to the plant communities, which plant communities can even exist there in the first place. And then the plant communities, as they change through time, their offspring are now changing, and they are too. They're changing the site itself. So the organisms change the site, and the site kind of dominates and controls what can be expressed in those particular organisms, and it goes on and on and on a million different ways. There is a certain fallacy being spread within permaculture circles that all things cooperate and everything's cooperating with one another to make a greater good. Well, if we do some tests, we can actually show that there is competition between species, even within species. There's also cooperation between species. Mutualism is what it's called. And there's also a lot of neutral interactions. There's all three different things are expressed. It's not just all cooperation. So how does this all work? Imagine juggling 150,000 juggling balls all at the same time and somehow managing to keep most of them in the air. And like I said, the landscape ecosystem itself, the regional climate, the shape, this is your steep land versus flat land, cold versus hot. This all affects what can grow there ecologically. And these are called successional filters. Anything that is a determinant on what can actually survive there, that's a filter. If you can't survive in this particular place, you won't be found there. And that's also what is somewhat different about restoration agriculture as opposed to so many other just regenerative agriculture or organic agriculture or even permaculture, is that we accept the number one successional filter, and it's that what we're going to do is we're going to pick things that already have a long historic and a current successful track record of surviving in our area. We're going to start right there. We're going to take the ultimate successional filter, and that we're going to pick things that are at least regionally adapted.
Mark, I'm going to jump in for just a second.
Sure.
One person is saying they're having a screen frozen, but would the rest of you throw in either a 1 if you're seeing and hearing everything all right, or a 9 if you're not, and then just see real quick. I get some 1, so go ahead, Mark. Keep going. So whoever that was, I think it's your system.
Okay, so some of the like these differential species performance, some of the characteristics in the plants that help with their colonization of a site, their occupation of a site, and their thriving on a particular site are their understory tolerance? Can they handle shade? Are they drought tolerant? Do they produce a lot of seed? Is their seed little, so it's blown in the wind? Is it larger? How does the seed get dispersed? What about its growth rate? Does it grow fast in the early years, slow at first, and fast later? All these different behaviors, all these different traits are part of the successional dance that nature does through time. And how we interact with a natural system is we want to observe, of course, obviously observe to see how it works, and then learn how to mimic the disturbance regimes of our place. And then we talked about some very simple phases, obviously oversimplified, of plant succession. Once there is a disturbance, so prior to stand initiation of this slide up here, there's some sort of disturbance. Then there's a stand initiation. It gets colonized. Almost every single piece of growing space is filled up. Then there's the stem exclusion phase. After that, as the whole site is occupied, there's competitive mutualisms and neutral interactions between the plants till they start to sort themselves out. That makes opportunity for understory reinitiation. The undergrowth starts to grow again. Eventually, long-term, minus repeated disturbances, there'll be an old growth state. We'll kind of go through all of that. So we start with this disturbance. Obviously, a clear cut is a disturbance. It is similar to a fire. Probably it could be debated whether it's more similar to a fire or a blowdown. I would make it more similar to a fire simply because the organic matter is gone from the site. Fire would have volatilized it, turned into mostly smoke, heat. Then the site obviously is way more sunny, so the site itself is hot, and there's a lot more oxidation going on with the organic matter on the surface. What it doesn't have that firewood is much of this is reduced to ash, and a lot of the nutrients bound up in the biomass would be immediately available for release for whatever regeneration is about to happen. So there's a disturbance first. There's that same agricultural field. This is an ecological disturbance. Here's an ecological disturbance. This is the most common natural microtopography feature, pit and mound topography. The reason why I spend so much time on it is that I think it's critical to our understanding of how a lot of things work in nature and it shows us a ecological basis for a lot of work that permaculturists do. We've got a pit and a mound, that's a swale and a berm. We've got organic matter incorporated with soil, that's kind of hugelkultur. One of the things, however, that it does reveal is the permaculture obsession with wanting to make sure that the ground is always covered with organic matter, that there's some sort of mulch here. Well, that actually prevents a lot of plants from growing. That's one of the reasons why people use mulch, because it prevents weeds from growing. Well, there's a lot of other species, perfectly useful species, that also require bare mineral soil. Right down here, we've got a little acorn right down on the bottom here. Notice it's moister in the shade of this pit. Leaves will blow in. There'll be a mini compost pile. Pit and mound architecture is normal, so we can imitate that in our systems. And this is a topographical map, just a rough sketch of a property in south central Virginia, where we recently worked. 3 weeks ago, we featured this, and we'll actually feature quite a bit of this. This first line, the master line, is the overall pattern that moves the water where we want it to go, and then the other patterns are the other lines are all parallel to it. But they're a swale and berm complex. We're imitating massive blowdown. Here comes our massive blowdown machine. It's going to move through. It's going to expose the mineral soil as a seed bed. It's going to incorporate roots with rocks, with soil, but it's going to do it in a linear fashion and steer the water in the general direction where we want it to go. And we will invade this site with our seeds of choice, which in this case is pasture grasses. Sometimes we'll disturb the site with one of these devices. A forestry mulcher is what they're called sometimes. Go through and grind this. This is very similar to a fire, once again, minus the oxidation of material and the immediate release of the nutrients. This is like a slow fire. All the organic matter will decompose, exposes the seed bed to new seeds for colonization. And this is the stand. So what happens after this disturbance is now stand initiation, establishment. This is that property in Southern Virginia. Is newly established. It's probably within 5 years or so of being established. The pines in here, longleaf and loblolly pine, were planted. The other stuff, we'll see later what that's called, planted itself. How do we imitate the initiation phase after disturbance? By planting things, absolutely. One of the models of succession is called the relay floristics model. And it's basically set up that says that the first species that are there that colonize a site change your site to a certain extent and prepare it for the next sequence and the next one and the next one and the next one. So there's a logical sequence through time. That's the relay floristics model. The relay floristics model also is somewhat driven by seed delivery methods. Are seed light and blown in with the wind? Do birds take a berry and perch on something and drop it by accident, or a nut, or whatever that is? How do these species get there, and do they arrive over a period of time is a question. Do we have plant material available? If we just abandon a disturbed site, will it colonize as thickly? This place had all kinds of propagules available to it and was surrounded by a seed source. This farm right here where we're planting trees, these are hazelnuts, I believe, getting put in the ground, was surrounded by more cornfields. You can see there was some medium-sized trees in the background, mostly box elder in this case. As you can see, this is how we're imitating the stand establishment. What's frequently done is in tree planting is trees are recommended they plant them like 8 feet apart or 10 feet apart, whatever the situation is. And I've actually been experimenting and participating in research being done by our local Department of Natural Resources and the Southwest Badger Resource Conservation Development Board on high-density plantings and their effects on colonization of the site. one of the things that does happen is if you start planting a few trees scattered widely apart, and this happened to me in the early years, recommendations say that you plant your chestnut trees 30 feet apart. Well, I couldn't tolerate 30 feet, so I put them at 25, and they were still impossibly far apart. So then if you have two trees in a row that die, now your trees are, see if I do the math, right, 25, 20, 75 feet apart, and that's like really impossibly far apart. You never colonize the site, and the next natural succession that was coming that way anyways, your species doesn't get favored, and you have a competitive disadvantage. Whereas if you do plant trees the way nature plants trees, you plant a bunch of them at the same time. Nature's dumping tons of seed. It's blowing in with the wind. It's falling off of nut trees. It's being buried and scattered by animals. Lots of seed. This is one way that one of the wisecrack, smarty pants tree planters thinks that they can finish earlier to plant 5 different trees in the same hole. Well, if you have limited space, why not? Especially clumping trees like birch or maple, even oaks, chestnuts. If they need pollinators. How about apple trees? Plant a clump of several different species or several different varieties right in the same hole, and now you'll get a clump that can pollinate themselves, one another. This is done with chestnut. This is a double row of chestnut planted on New Forest Farm. The row between rows is 3 feet apart, and within rows the trees are put in at 18 inches apart. Of course, we have a advantage in that we're producing the seed that becomes these trees, so we have lots of them available. But this way you can plant the trees in the ground, use no herbicides, no tillage, and the trees so dominate the site that they take it over and they start establishing a shade at a real early age, like 2 or 3 years. If you had trees like this, imagine that double row, within 2 or 3 years, you've got a little bit of shade and almost forest-like conditions underneath. So imitating nature and planting high density, that's a whole bunch of different advantages that we'll talk about later. But what this is for all practical purposes, that's our genetic selection. This is a filter. The ones that aren't suited for this site are going to die, and good riddance. The ones that are suited to this site, we want. Then all the other criteria that we choose, we select for through time, and we'll get to that. Now, advanced regeneration are propagules of other species that are there. In this picture, we can see the snipped off little stumps of some kind of tree or shrub that was in this area before it was mowed. This is also at the Southern Virginia site. This is where the forestry mower and a brush hog had gone through and mowed everything clean. In this situation, this particular place, the machinery is used to set a succession back towards grassland phase and to be the competitive disadvantage for the shrubbery. I'm pointing with my finger to the screen, you can't see. To be the competitive disadvantage of the shrubbery and allow the grass to dominate the site. But these roots, any seeds that are in there, already existing trees that are sprouted, like this little, looks like a red cedar is sprouted, that's the advanced regeneration. That's what's going to come on and grow on that site anyways. This is the moment when we have to now insert ourselves onto this site and stack the deck ahead of time with the species that we want, that's our preferred species for whatever reason. So initial floristic composition is another type of way of describing succession. It's another successional model, method of understanding. A lot of where a site is going in the future is determined up front by what's already there at the beginning, the initial floristic composition. I'll show some stuff later on that'll show examples of this. Is if you get your plants in at this stage right here, and you set up your species or your plant communities as a dominant feature in this landscape, instead of one chestnut tree every 30 feet, pack them in like this, you've now rigged the initial floristic composition in your favor a little bit. In this case, the initial floristic composition was all about the tulip poplar and sweet gum. They just so dominated the site, and there was a tremendous amount of red maple in there as well, and some oaks, but we'll see what the situation is with the oaks. They were there. Then, of course, all the pines. So the initial floristic composition of the site, here are the species you've got to work with now. Now for the rest of this site, we can manage by removal. This site, you're going to have a hard time going into this and changing succession through time because it's already occupied. It's already, the stand has been initiated. Now these are your players that you have to work with. So get in there early, at the right at the disturbance, right after the disturbance phase, and stack the deck. It's not in your favor necessarily, but you've got the species that you need to work with through time. And that's the whole point of running a sustainable farm, is doing it for the rest of your life. This is another site that shows some of the initial floristic composition. And what I like that this shows right here is, look at all the grasses. We have as an option here to go in a number of different directions based on the species present. We have sweet gum, which has a certain, it likes certain sites and it creates certain conditions. There was I thought that was a red maple in here. There's red maple that's very shade tolerant. There's some raspberries in the understory. There's grass. Well, now in the goldenrod. So grass and goldenrod, they hark back to a successional phase prior. They're a more sunny open. So prior in time, this was more dominated by grasses, and now they're being outcompeted. We also have the pines in here. We have a number of different successional directions we can go in, all of which are okay, all of which will produce yields for us depending on our values and our goals. This is a picture from New Forest Farm, my farm in Southwest Wisconsin. I talked about this a little bit with mutualism and cooperation and competition in plants. Well, there are certain species that will facilitate the growth of other species. And this one, what we have right here, this is prickly ash. It's common in the Midwest. This is really the only place I've ever seen it heavy is the Midwest. It's a real thorny, shrubby plant. It keeps cattle out from grazing. So the grazers stop grazing there, and then the shrub grows up. At first, I fought against it because of that and cut it down repeatedly, and it sprouts back vigorously because it's accustomed to burning and browsing. But the soil that's created underneath it is just the most amazing, fantastic, black, crumbly soil. It's one of the most beautiful soil makers. I have no idea what the soil test would look like on it, but as far as to be able to work with it yourself and to have other trees get established in it, it makes incredible soil. So this is somewhat of a facilitator. Also, to a certain extent, this tree right here, black locust, is a facilitator to a certain extent that it helps other stages of succession. However, what it does, it's very vigorous competitor in the early years, and it jumps right through the middle phase. It loves being out here in the open sun. It colonizes grasslands. The thorns help to prevent browsing. But then it would quickly shade this and inhibit the growth of these middle successional species. This is a polyculture row of chestnut and serviceberry and apple. And here is a row, you can see these a little bit up in the upper corner here, of hybrid poplar. And then there's a row of red and silver maple to the left side of this. And this was planted probably, matter of fact, it was 10 years ago, 2006, because I know who helped plant these trees. It was Garrett and Melissa of the Good Life Farm in New York. And then what we did for the 10 years since then, so we did our initiation and did nothing to it. Stunned, sheer total utter neglect. And so what we're going to be able to do is very rapidly, with one input into this, one entry into this site, we can change the successional pathway to radically favor our food species. So in the meantime, in the early years, we got our grazing in, and we picked raspberries. We picked elderberry blossoms, elderberries themselves, and then now we'll convert it to a different successional stage with income. We'll be getting some sort of yield from the site when we do the work. So facilitation, helping these other species get established. Inhibition would be preventing them. These black locusts would very quickly inhibit the growth of chestnut and apple trees, simply because of their shade. They're very aggressive. They're water hungry. Yes, they're putting nitrogen in the ground. What they'll do is they'll make a deep shade, eliminate most of the ground cover underneath it, and then only the shade tolerance. The late successional trees like red maple and sugar maple could get established underneath in basswood when it's there. And tolerance is it doesn't really have any effect on the other species. They tolerate each other, and they kind of don't change succession. So this right here was a before and after of the same area. And how much work did it take to get there? Very little work at all. Whereas if you had set this up as a chestnut orchard 10 years ago, you would have had to do everything that you're supposed to do in the chestnut orchard grower's book in manual and all that kind of stuff. And all we did was 10 years ago, site initiation, dominate the site with our species, then manage it lightly by getting a yield, by grazing it with animals. And then once it goes beyond the successional phase, the berries aren't where we're at. They're not as abundant as they used to be. Black locust is starting to take over. The prickly ash is taking over. There's a lot of multiflora rose coming in there. Then we go through, and one of the videos we showed a couple weeks ago showed the process by which we did this in the course of one summer. All right, so now we're at the stem exclusion thinning stage. That's what happened here. This place is now at the stem exclusion phase, and trees, shrubs, vines, canes will start to die. Someone is going to be losing the struggle for light, for water, for nutrients. And we're going to make sure that our species get those nutrients and get the light. At the stem exclusion stage, you see here the ones that, for whatever reason, maybe they're susceptible to disease, maybe they are more likely to decay, they're in a wetter spot, they were damaged by logging, or a moose stepped on the root and the fungus got in there, who knows why. Notice the understory it's become very shady, and now the grasses have gone. Some of the characteristics of the stem exclusion phase is you've now closed the canopy. The initiation phase up to stem exclusion. Stem exclusion kind of happens when you have total site dominance. It's colonized by anything and everything that possibly can. There's no more room for any other species to sprout. Then the ones that are there and are dominant, that are growing better for whatever reason, they begin to dominate the site literally. They're exuding more root exudates, dropping more leaves. They're changing the site physically, they're changing the site chemically, the light relations, the water relations, and then others die. And notice, though, the seed that's coming up in the shade. We only see seed of the shade-tolerant plants, in this case, red maple. You will not see regeneration of the sun-loving plants in the shade at this phase, and no grass. So to you or me as a landowner, this is the phase where you basically get no income out of it, and there's very little food coming out of it, unless you count those 2 grouse that you shot 3 Octobers ago when you were wandering through the brush. This, however, gives us our template of species to work with. What do we have here? In the foreground, we have a hickory. So if I'm favoring, I want to have eventually a silvopasture system. I want to have a fire-tolerant plant that has nuts to help feed the pigs, for example, and lots of grass growing at its base. Or do I want to have closed canopy pine forest, a lot more mosses on the ground, a lot more acid? It'll create more acid conditions. So we have different directions and different values that will be fulfilled by choosing which species we choose. This is an interesting site at New Forest Farm. We'll see this picture again. Sometimes at the stem exclusion phase, some individuals dominate. So this, just keep in mind this tree right here. This will be a reference tree. We'll see it later. That's just a white spruce tree. I planted a row of white spruce in this field. Yeah, this field 21 years ago, and basically did nothing to it. I planted red maple and sugar maple and white spruce here, more northern hardwood species, and turned it loose. Done nothing to it for 21 years. What's interesting is some mulberry got established early on, and with its branching pattern, captured a lot of the canopy, a lot of the light. 3 little trees here that have this center part of the whole entire canopy is theirs. Then around the outskirts, on the outside edges, others that got established. So somehow this shade that it produced excluded other regeneration except for raspberries, multiflora rose, and whatnot. And it's kind of in this state of limbo whereas the smaller regeneration is dying out and dying out, and we're being left behind with fewer and fewer stems. In the early years of any kind of site establishment, you're going to have way more stems, and later on, you're going to have far fewer stems. Thinning of the forest, loss of individual trees is normal. Removal of them becomes an option that we have, and the species we have available here at our fingertips go in a number of different directions. What if we open this back up again and removed the non-fruit and nut-bearing trees and got some more light in here so some more grass would grow? We'd have a lot more raspberries, more grapes would be growing in here. The mulberries would be doing fine. We'd have grass for grazing animals. Or what if we think that the mulberries have taken up too much space and would rather have black cherry or bitternut hickory or some other species? We know that the stem exclusion phase is going to happen. Whether we're involved with it or not, any site that's been disturbed severely, has been colonized by a whole bunch of plants, it's going to get to the stage where all of a sudden plants are going to lose. They're going to die for whatever reason. So how do we insert ourselves into that phenomena and interact with it? We already talked a little bit about some of these other ones. This we showed a couple weeks ago. This exact site right here, I went in to show the farm crew how I would select for species in this particular spot, and their goals were a silvopasture system with cattle and hogs long term. So I marked out the finest, most vigorous growing trees. In this case, these are oaks. There's a few hickories in there. There was one pecan that we selected for that would eventually come to dominate the site. You just cut them down with a brush saw. You can let your animals graze these, or you can mow them with a flail chopper, chip them up. Underneath, there's raspberries already in the understory, blackberries in the understory. We can now, that this has been disturbed, we can now go plant our species of choice in that row to dominate that part of the site, that particular niche. And in this case, we let a few the sweet gum grow because they are fast growing, a really decent lumber, soft, easy to work with. So we have 2 sweet gum that we left behind, and only when they start to seriously slow down the growth of the oaks will we remove them, and we'll use them for building material, poles, etc. Keeping a multiplicity or multiple species in it. And shade tolerance is really significant at the stem exclusion phase, and it's important to us when we're interacting with the system. Here's a picture right here with these oaks, and I talked a little bit about it on the previous slide. The oaks are sun-loving. They have to have the sun. In this picture right here, the oaks are going to eventually lose out. They're going to lose out, and this will be dominated by the sweet gum. There was a couple of pines in there, but they probably would lose out as well, and it'd just be a thicket of sweet gum that then would make its own stem exclusion. So by opening it up, now the oaks have a chance. They'll start to dominate the site. They can start to chemically change the site, but they will not make it at this phase right here. And oftentimes, this is where you'll see oak. And oak actually, a couple of different forestry groups have basically signed on saying that this may be the last generation of oaks in the USA as a forest type. They'll still exist as trees, individuals as species, but oaks across North America are not regenerating the way they once did. Why is that? Because of their disturbance adaptation. You got to remember, they were fire-adapted species. These little oaks over here, these little oaks right here, are hanging out right there, building up roots. All of a sudden, if a fire were to go through this site right here, it would torch all the other ones off, and it would give the oaks a nice flush of fertilizer, full sun, and it'd grow like crazy. So there's no more or not as much mimicry of fire in our forested ecosystems in the East since the 1930s. And so oak is gradually losing out because it's a mid-succession fire-tolerant species. Well, knowing that, we can select for it if we want. Or we can say, yeah, we're interested in sweet gum or a 25-year turnaround. The quickest turnaround in this particular part of the world where the site is in pine lumber. This site right here, we can let it turn into a sweet gum forest, which right now these sweet gum would dominate. They'd shade out the pines would die, and the little oak regeneration that we saw in the previous picture, it's on the understory, it's on the ground here. All the blackberries in here will eventually die out. The grasses obviously will die out in the shade. They've already started to in the shade here. So where do we want to go? Do we want to have a sweet gum site? We do nothing. We've got a sweet gum site. Do we want to have pines that we harvest for saw logs in a mere 20 more years because they'll be that big in time? Or do we want to have oak long term? Well, we can select for oak and sweet gum, open up where most of the oak regeneration is so the oak grows, or we can have pine and oak. They're both compatible. But these are the suite of species we get to choose from. And now I get to play the game. This particular operation, it's like, yeah, we want to know what kind of berries we can grow here. What types of berries? We think maybe blueberries would do good, and, raspberries would kind of do good. And I said, well, hello, you're surrounded by about 120 acres of blackberries. How about grow blackberries? Oh, we don't need to. They're all over the place. It's like, well, that's the point. That's really the point of restoration agriculture, is figuring out how to work with what we have. Here's our oaks. So we can turn this into a long-term oak overstory with raspberries in the row between oak trees. Find where your oak trees are, and then mow alleys of grass to graze animals in. So we can have animals for regular cash flow, or we can grow small grains, or we can grow other produce crops, and our berries are in the row with the oaks. Well, what if they're not all the ideal ultimate varieties? Well, you do like what I did last week in Kentucky. They had about a 50-acre field that was all overgrown with blackberries. They may not be the perfect varieties, but we know that blackberries grow really, really well right here on this site. And as we were walking through the fields, I saw this one last blackberry hanging out on a bush. This is in October. And so then I set that blackberry down and talked about it. It's like, how many people know which blackberries out there have the first fruit in the spring? Okay, great. How many people know where the plant is with the last fruit in the fall? Well, I do, because I was looking for it. How do you know? Who knows where the sweetest ones are? The ones that taste like a particular, flavor profile. Anytime you have this amazing natural resource at your disposal, there are amazingly magical plants in it, but we will never find them unless we go looking for them. So do you think that the earliest blackberries on the market might give you some sort of competitive advantage when you're selling stuff, or the last blackberry of the season? Everybody wants to have one last taste of summer before it all disappears. We have an amazing amount, even, I forgot your name already, in New Zealand. You have an amazing number of resources at your disposal. The creativity issue is with us, one, being willing to interact with the site with the way it's set up, and two, figuring out how to market the products that are there.
It was Sue, by the way, in New Zealand.
There you go. All right, thank you, Sue. And here's another situation showing a certain amount of succession. Also gives us a little bit of our insight into our landscape, reading landscapes. This tree right here is a gigantic white oak, and this white oak, it's over 100 years old, based on the stump sizes of other large trees that we saw, counted the rings. This has grown in the open probably for 90 out of the 100 years, because it would grow up and it didn't have any need to stretch for the sun because it had full sun, and it just grew up in this gigantic, wide, branching tree, and it dominated the site. So we know for the past 100 years, this site has been grass. It's been an oak savanna with this oak standing out in the middle of it. Well, then probably 20 or 30 years ago, grazing was stopped around here. And so then this tree's seeds grow up into this next generation of young trees after it. Succession is happening. It's changing from a savanna to a closed canopy forest. And then most of this understory here is also oak, all from either the mother tree or all these young daughter trees. So here we've had one individual tree has changed the whole entire site with all the seed that has dropped down, and stem exclusion is going to occur. It's already starting to occur because you notice the big branches here on the side of the tree have started to die. They'll die, decay will set in, the tree will rot from the inside out, owls and raccoons can nest in it and all that kind of stuff, and eventually it'll fall over, leave a gap, and then there's more succession takes place. We can interact with this site, and we can remove these trees, maybe inoculate them with mushrooms to grow shiitake mushrooms. Then we can graze the dickens out of this underneath and get some more light in there so the grass grows. And suddenly we've moved it back in successional time, so it's an oak savanna with this big grand tree growing in the grass. And we did it while making firewood, maybe some saw logs, definitely some mushroom logs, so there's income there, and then grazing animals. That's an income generating activity to move this back in succession. Or we can move it forward in succession and go towards closed canopy oak forest by removing selected trees one at a time as we need them, making mushrooms, saw logs, etc. So here's how we did this with chestnut. We overplanted in the early stage. This was planted at a stem density, I think it was pushing 4,000 stems an acre. Some years I don't sell all my trees. Some years they're all sold out. This is at Forest Agriculture Enterprises. This year, right now, we have a good abundance of the hybrid hazelnut, so please order plenty of that. We have a good supply of Korean stone pine, and the hybrid chestnuts, these guys, children, is going fast this year. We sold out really quick last year. So we start with a super high density planting. You see the rows. They're already starting to exclude one another. This one right here is starting to get scrizzly and it's dying for lack of resources for whatever reason. So what I had done previously is gone through and selected the trees that have the fastest reproduction, produce the most, the largest seeds, pest and disease free, a whole bunch of different selection criteria. And any geneticist worth their salt knows that you can't select for more than two, criteria at the same time, or else the numbers go off the charts. Well, that's why we can select for, multiple different characteristics at the same time, because we have so many individuals to choose from. So what we did here is we did a partial coppice. We went through in late winter. This was just taken a few days ago. And we removed the trees that did not have the qualities that met our objectives. And the butt logs have become inoculated with shiitake mushrooms, and the medium-sized logs became firewood, and then the smallest branches get chipped. So that's an income-generating activity because I'm generating firewood and mushroom logs, and it's also an income-increasing activity because it lets more sun in, the grass can grow. We got at least 3 grazings out of this particular site this summer already. Now you can see the root sprouts. Chestnut is a fire-adapted species. It sprouts readily from the root. What's also interesting is you can see some in here. There's some second generation. Some nuts must have gotten planted in a rodent tunnel here, and they've sprouted. So by thinning this out, getting more light in, now these guys are going to have an opportunity to express themselves. Not just the original plants we put in, but our original plants plus their offspring. This is what it looked like when we had the branches. Took our firewood out of it. On the right has been thinned, probably 50–60%. On the left, look how dense they are. You can see how the grass has died underneath. This is just one growing season worth of sunshine getting in there for grass recovery. And then this is a couple seasons out there. So it's like 2 seasons out there, and this is 1 season of recovery. And eventually, who knows, maybe we'll have chestnut trees 30 feet apart. I don't know if we'll ever get to be that thin of a density at this particular place. But the grass is part of it. What is interesting, see the trees that are left behind. I've talked about this before. Just like with carrots, is when you thin your trees out, they need more light, they need more water, they need more nutrients, etc. When you thin them out a little bit, the individuals grow faster. One of the strengths of a coppice woodlot system like this is one of the goals is to keep the majority of the plants in juvenile phase, kind of like teenagers for human beings, which is always the most rapid growth is right in their teenage years. If you're a 600-year-old tree, this might be 50 to 100 years. With chestnut, if you keep it younger than 20 or 30 years old, the growth is incredibly fast. Some oak on our site will grow increasingly fast up to about 50 or 60 years. But that right there is a sweet spot that we want to stay in, where you get both woody crop growth and grass growth, both at the same time. This is a savanna system, not completely closed canopy. The trees are at their fastest rate of growth. We're maximizing the amount of, trying to optimize anyways, the amount of solar flux through the system. So right about there probably is like the ultimate sweet spot of early successional accelerated growth, so really cranking pastures in fields, and then really cranking tree growth kind of intersect right there in this middle teenage years hyperactive growth phase. It's also the healthiest. Notice how healthy you were when you were a teenager, unless you had some sort of chronic situation. Those are most people's most healthy years. Come back to this site again, and you see how young and juvenile all this is, but there's been some kind of inhibition going on. And I think part of it had to do with these mulberries creating shade. Shrubs actually have a pretty significant inhibitory effect. And if you want an example of that, like look at the any Mediterranean region where the overstory wide savanna canopy, either of oaks or like in California, be the redwoods. Once those have disappeared and it's all turned to scrub chaparral, shrubs really have an inhibitory effect on any kind of successional pathway, really, and they can get stuck in the shrub phase for long, long, long periods of time. That's to our advantage if we're growing a shrub crop, but not if we're growing a tree crop. So this right here, aside from planting the maples and the pines years ago, and I mean the spruce, notice most of the spruce got selected against. Some of the maples are still in there. This is with 0 inputs whatsoever, what it looks like after 20 years. Whereas right across the road from it is a similar site where we've been actively removing trees. In this particular spot here, we've been removing about 4 or 5 tons of wood per year, starting when the stems were really, really small, 1.5 inches, 2 inches in diameter. We've been removing tons of wood per year. We've been making mushrooms on some of the wood. We've been tapping maple trees way before when you're supposed to tap maple trees. We basically tapped maple trees when they were like this big, because if we didn't tap maple trees, my kids wouldn't have grown up with sugar maple culture as part of their life heritage. And so this is what it looked like with active harvests every single year. That with no harvests, and that with harvest. Where do you see more actual trees? Here or here? Which ones look more useful? Here or here? We can actually insert ourselves into the stem exclusion phase. This piece of land right here that we're looking at, I could probably interact with this for the next 100 years of my life and really not harm it at all. The trees are just going to be getting better and better and better because I'm always removing the crooked ones, the rotten ones, the diseased ones, the ones that don't produce the way that we want them to. We'll be allowing other regeneration to occur. A little bit further on, this is a site that's had more intervention, same age as that picture 2 slides ago. Here they are, the same age. This is how to get more trees growing faster by cutting them down. But this is how it works. This is imitating natural processes. This is imitating all these stumps that you see around here. These are the ones that lost the battle for dominance of this site, and they lost at the hands of a chainsaw instead of through natural selective forces. It's accelerated the development of the site into a forest system because the trees have stayed in that hyperactive growth, and there have been fewer and fewer inhibitions. So what we want to do is go in here and remove the inhibitory effects and enhance some facilitative effects. And this is a picture of the two side by side. Same, it looked exactly the same 21 years ago, I kid you not. On the left, I did not plant any trees. On the right, I planted white spruce, I planted sugar maple and red maple. And on the right, I harvested nothing. I took nothing out of this whatsoever, cut no trees. On the left, I started cutting trees right away. I was cutting brush and thinning, like I'd go through here with pruners, and prune that out and select for the trees that I wanted. So the trees that I selected grew faster, dominated the site quicker. Here's another example. 21 years ago, see this little spruce tree? I kid you not. It's that little spruce tree. Got it? This is a radical change from here to here for 20 years. Instead of doing nothing, nothing resulted in this, fewer trees, doing something, harvesting the trees that were planted, harvesting aggressively, got trees on the left. So we already saw this. This is 21 years of development, do nothing. Another site, what I did is I overplanted onto the grass, and you can see some of the trees, the spruce trees here, coming through. I overplanted, or whatever, cast out in there, stuck them in with a shovel, a lot of bitternut hickory nuts. I just stabbed the ground with a shovel, dropped the nut in the ground, and walked away. Did nothing, did not remove any material here whatsoever. So this is the effect of hickories coming into the site. Obviously, the brush, mostly prickly ash in this case here, has exhibited an inhibitory effect on other trees regenerating. There's plenty of ash trees nearby that could be throwing in seed. There's plenty of oaks nearby that could be having acorns put out in there. None of it's regenerated under that brush except for the trees that I put in place. Here's another part of that same ridge that I actually planted with American chestnut. I got the original plant material from California, I believe it is. And look at the radical difference. Chestnut is an incredibly aggressive grower, American chestnut. And it's grown way fast, dominated the site, and it's showed an incredible inhibitory effect on the understory. Look at how fast it just eradicated everything. Even the raspberries and the other brambles that are thriving under the mulberry with the spruce and maples, not even they could exclude the other material like this. But once again, this is with no cutting. The one that had, in my opinion, the most wood, the most useful wood, was all of this that I had actively managed and selected for the natural regeneration that showed up on the site. So it was with the material that I had, more trees, higher quality trees. This is the site that I have, that I've actively managed that and cut trees year after year after year after year after year. I'm at the stage in my life, my age and physically, and the site has developed such that I can almost not keep up with all the trees. I have to keep cutting them fast enough just to keep them in their hyperactive, fast growth phase. This is not my site, but this is what it would eventually start to look like. With decent thinning, you can get a nice, solid stand of whatever your species of choice are by actively harvesting them, where we are inserting ourselves into the stem exclusion phase, and we're pulling out material that's useful for us, produces an income, produces food, etc. Then at some point in time, then the understory, there's a reinitiation of the understory. And if it's a closed canopy situation, then this will be shade tolerant species. Or it may be this case right here is shade tolerant species. You see the red maple. Not a lot of oaks will be able to regenerate in here. Not a lot of pines will be able to regenerate in here. What we had the understory reinitiation phase here. What is happening up in here is there are a lot of sugar maples and silver maples, little tiny plants. I don't even see any here. You know, little tiny 6 to 12 inch tall plants that are in basswood especially are really colonizing the site. They'll grow slow. They don't care about the shade. They'll just sometimes plants just live longer than the other ones, and the ones that'll dominate the site, like the sugar maple and basswood, they could hang out in the shade for 300, 400, 500 years, and then everything else falls over and rots, and they'll be there, they'll grow, they'll dominate the site. Now, old growth is typically composed of pockets of all the same age trees, and then they fill in gaps caused by disturbances. And what will happen is you got like that stand you saw, my real healthy, happy stuff back here, point right there. Eventually what will happen is if this was left to its own devices, you have fewer and fewer trees. They're all very even age class. These are all about 21 years old trees in that site. Then eventually some will get old, they'll fall over, either they'll rot or they'll blow down, and then there's a gap produced. And then succession starts again in miniature in those pockets. So old growth is characterized not just by exclusively old trees, but pockets of even-aged trees and gaps that have been filled with also even-aged trees within them. And here's a picture of down in near the Virginia site. These gigantic oak trees starting to break. These are about 2 feet diameter, starting to rot. And then this understory here, this understory that was initiated, now gets more sun and it starts to grow. There's another view of trees where they've opened up a gap. We're going to talk about gap dynamics, I think, next week, because there are some specific things that happen. Here's just a case of a eastern red cedar. A lot of people don't like eastern red cedar. The way to beat eastern red cedar is open it up a little bit, cut some down, Oh, that'll make it go faster and it'll give room for more of them to sprout. Well, yeah, that's right. But then you plant things in there that are going to overtop the eastern red cedar. Because when it comes to shade, eastern red cedar, junipers cannot tolerate it. There they go, they die. This is not a cooperative effect between these different species. This was a competitive effect. It was a resource, light. These trees found out where the light was. They even pushed their branches right through the eastern red cedar and captured the light and starved that eastern red cedar of light and took it over. This is a case of a right there kind of tree, tulip poplar that blows over. An old tree falls over. This is like 3-foot diameter, and a piece of its root's still alive. The advanced regeneration, it's the next forest coming on. Trees fall over. This is a picture I got off the internet of an old growth forest in Hawaii. We see the remains of a tree, and look at all the light that's coming in here. A new gap is formed. New succession is going to take place in the gap. And here's another image from online showing of what a gap will look like in the ecosystem in the forest. And then this is one that I took down in Virginia of this gap forming when disturbance, and in this case it was wind. Wind came through, knocked over a big pocket in the woods, and look at all the young stuff starting to grow up underneath it. All of these phases in succession have opportunities for us, economic opportunities for us. On richer, more fertile sites, there will be more opportunities, obviously. On less fertile sites, fewer opportunities. On the extremes of super cold or super acid, super alkaline, super hot, all of the extreme sites have fewer opportunities for economic interaction with them, and they don't respond as well to treatment and manipulation. They're more suited for adaptation techniques, so we have to adapt to those sites instead of tweaking those sites so they just function better. We can still do that, but it has less of an effect on the extreme sites than it does on the richer sites. So next week we'll talk about some specific examples of succession from around the USA. Sorry New Zealand, sorry England, a lot of the species are the same. You'll be able to follow along, enough of it's relevant. The individual species aren't the issue. The issue is are the conceptual framework and how all these things work together. We're going to talk about gap dynamics and more next week on Wednesday, to be continued.
Awesome. Very, very good, as always. If you guys liked it, throw in some ones. I have about 6 or 7 questions, Mark, and a couple comments. I'm just going to throw them out at you. Mark's not able to see the questions tonight. First, just a comment. Sam's given us a pretty cool picture that we're going to throw up on the site of one of the things you were talking about. So thank you for that, Sam. This is just Sue going back to her question about.
Sue. This is the great, wise, and wonderful Sue who asks us questions every week from New Zealand.
Yeah. Her question last week about steep land was way too vague. What I'm interested in is how much swaling is relevant, water management in general.
That would be a good question for another time. I will address that quite extensively because there's all kinds of factors, soil type, rainfall type, distribution of rainfall during the season, type and structure and depth to bedrock, different species we have at our disposal to deal with whatever those site contingencies are. So there's a lot of factors involved in that, and I'm not in a position to be able to just give a general answer. I'm a swaler. In most cases that I've been to, I've seen a useful use, that's a good word, a beneficial use for some sort of swale and berm system. And nature is the proof of that, because you will find pit and mound structures everywhere in the world, even on places that we shouldn't put them. That's actually sometimes why they form, is like if you got shallow bedrock 6 inches down, you're going to have these trees falling over, ripping, and making swales all over the hill all the time anyways.
My place,
yeah.
And you saw that a year ago, Mark,
Yep.
where I have less than 6 inches of topsoil with sandstone growing right under it. This is one that's totally related. I didn't mean to get to this next, but it did. And this is from Jordan. and it's, do you find new trees coming in strong just below the pit in nature, similar to us planting just below a swale?
Actually, I've noticed quite a few different places. Most commonly, they're in the area of exposed soil, not on the organic matter. That's actually another thing. Yeah, another thing too with the organic matter is a certain amount of tillage. Horrible crime, right? Actually, is natural and normal. We got to expose that mineral soil so certain plants get exposed, or their seeds will actually sprout. I've noticed the most plants occurring on the inboard slope like this, going to the bottom of the swale, and then a lot on the upper edge of the root plate, as the root plate tips like that. I've seen a lot up on the upper edge. It's usually at the exposed soil where you see most of the plants starting to sprout. Cool. It's a new site. It's a disturbed site. It's available to them.
This is a cool one, and another continent being represented. Azo asks, we're considering agroforestry cropping enterprise. Is it okay to plant snake repellent trees where there are a lot of snakes? How do you address this on your properties?
What continent is this?
Tell me later. He's got pythons and cobras. Okay.
So, all right. Sounds like Africa to me. When you have a lot of snakes in your area, make sure that you do your best to mitigate in your behalf, because we don't want to set up a system that's dangerous to us. One of the things that you'd want to be careful with in snake countries, although a lot of really unmanaged brush is not necessarily good for a lot of the little greener. What's the green one that drops on your neck? It's about this big. A lot of stone walls with pockets for snakes to hide in is not always a good idea, like open stone walls. One of the things that on one project I worked with, their chicken coops were down by the, probably within 50 feet of the water, and then on the edge of the water was all this brush, mangroves, papyrus, all kinds of different trees growing in the water that was protecting the shore from erosion. Well, they had the chicken coops right down by the shore, and they kept losing chickens to pythons. And all we had to do is learn a little bit about the habits of the pythons, for example, and typically pythons eat birds. Ding, first thing we should have learned, right? Well, pythons typically hang out in the brush by the water, and they eat water birds. Okay, so now we put our chicken coop, birds, right next to the python habitat. In English, we would call that stupid. That was just, they didn't know. It wasn't stupid at all. It's just that's where they put it because the water's there. They could water the birds. So what we did is we put the chicken coop up on a hill. It's further away to get to. You have to carry water to the birds and feed to the birds. But we could set them up their own little habitat. They haven't lost any chickens to pythons since then, simply because we removed the chickens from the python habitat. And then all the manure and the compost that they make now can cascade downhill into their further garden plots below it. So if you have snake repellent trees, that's not a bad idea to have them in sight. I wouldn't mind having some around. What are those? Let us know what the species are, the snake repellent trees.
That'd be great. Here's a good one. Have you found any economic gain beyond mushrooms and lumber from things like red maple and white spruce?
Well, red maple, of course, is also tappable as sugar. So, yeah, but both red maple and white spruce, I plant those intentionally as lumber trees. We have to, just because I focus a lot on food, that doesn't mean we don't need other things. I use toilet paper usually every morning, sometimes more than once. And I'm okay with that, because I make sure that I'm planting enough trees that can go into the toilet paper industry so I can wipe my butt in the morning. And so timber is not a invalid crop just because it takes a long time to grow. And on good sites, you can get it really, really fast. I actually planted a whole bunch of white pine, which really has no commercial sawlog use till it's 50 to 75 years old. I planted it as house logs for my boys because I knew that by the time they were 25 or 30, if they needed to, they had enough white pine on the site, they can build themselves their starter home for him and their sweetheart.
Awesome.
So that's what I was, for firewood, firewood, saw logs, building material, poles, teepee poles.
Silas put a bunch of really great comments on here. I'm not going to read all of those, but he has a great question here also. And matter of fact, I was communicating with a little bit. We may have him do a guest webinar sometime. But he asks, where was the site with the American chestnut? And then the second part of the question, no blight there? Because you said it was another site.
The site with the American chestnut was right at New Forest Farm at my place in southwest Wisconsin. And no blight there is not true at all. We have heavy, heavy, heavy blight, but the trees usually don't get it until they're a certain size, age class, when their bark starts to split. And it was probably 10 years ago when chestnut blight first started showing up. And all of my Americans so far, obviously the Americans are going to get it. Well, then the ones that have a lot of American genetics in them also get it. And so when we are selecting, it's another one of these successional filters, is that we have chestnut blight on our site. Chestnuts will not persist on my site unless they have some sort of adaptation to be able to survive those conditions. The adaptations that they have is resistance to the blight, or they breed so fast that they produce the next generation before the parent tree gets blight and dies, and then the offspring produce so fast before they, and so on and so on. So we have a heavy disease load. The pictures of those trees that I took, that stand probably only has another couple of years before blight's going to take them all out.
Here is a great one, and we're going to do a couple more and then let Mark go, and we'll make sure we answer these in the future sessions. We get all these questions categorized, by the way. I'm trying to establish, and this is, by the way, from Tristan, I'm trying to establish a stand of black walnut, butternut, and black cherry where the site was previously entering stem exclusion of birch, beech, and sugar maple. What sort of disturbance regime should I be replicating for proper stand in initiation? Fire disturbance by clearing the slash, or should I have it imitate a blowdown scenario?
Well, what you would do is you'd look at your species, your chosen species, and if you're talking butternut, walnut, and what was the third one? And then
third one was black cherry.
Yeah, butternut, walnut, and cherry. All of those are fire tolerant species. If you look at sugar maple and beech, they're not tolerant. They're fire intolerant. They're also very late successional. And beech, we'll talk about that next week. Actually, beech is a gap specialist, and so isn't sugar maple. All they need is a little tiny pocket. This hole right here in this picture on the slide. If they were in there at all, they would be there almost forever, because you're almost never going to get rid of them unless you burn them out. And what the beech will do, it'll sprout back like crazy, but now you're on top of it. So if you cut it to imitate a whatever, a blowdown or a burn, and then continue to keep it mowed, and get your walnuts to dominate and exclude it, because once you got beech and sugar maple in there, you're late successional. You're in a different long-term into ecological succession, and walnut is like at the beginning third, and you can always go past the beech and the maple and plant eastern hemlock, but you want to plant walnut and butternut. So set it back. Cut it way down and be able to mow it to imitate fire.
So just a couple more questions, and then we're going to do the others later, but just one quick announcement. Come and listen to Mark and watch Mark tomorrow at noon Mountain Time if you can, or watch the replay. A couple more questions here. By the way,
just to let you know also about tomorrow is the thing tomorrow, what you'll notice, it'll be a lot of a summary of the whole entire forest ecology course. I'm going to hit high points from all the way back in the beginning up to this presentation right here tonight.
But I'm going to give you guys a warning. There will be tons of questions. These guys that host this, I've been to multiple of theirs, way more than Mark can answer in 5 hours. Be patient if you guys put questions in. Because it's our webinar, we're going to have all of them, and we'll be able to get, if Mark can't answer them for you, maybe even let the other people ask some, we'll ask them here, because you guys get to be with Mark every week, and we'll put them on the side. 2 more questions. When talking about the benefits of swales and pits, please, oh, excuse me, not a question. Please include consideration of flatland and any alternative. I think that is really kind of a question.
Oh,
So
I would, what do you mean consideration of flatland? If you have a big wind and it knocks a tree over on flat land, you make a pit and a mound. You now have a swale and a berm. There is a ecological fact right there. Well, now if we go ahead and we make pits and mounds, we expose new soil as a new planting site. We can establish new things on it. We can actually manage the water on that flat ground. And I think it was last week as an example, this place in Louisiana, not only is it flat ground, we're 3 feet below sea level. So yeah, absolutely they have a context. In all situations, the net result of what a swale and berm does is different. It's different based on the soil type, the slope, the soil, etc.
awesome. By the way, you had a ton of people clapping with ones. It was great. Thank everybody. This is Sue. We're going to end on the great and amazing Sue, and I'll have one comment before that, which was Aza, the site he was talking about, is in Zambia, Southern Africa. So
Yep.
Here's Sue. Great question here. We do find pit and mound. This is on her property. I wonder whether it's possible to swale by planting the species that have dense growth close to the ground on areas that's too steep for machinery.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And you know, I don't know what your specific species type are. There's a lot of alders I know of in like northern latitudes that it's like these clumps of alders keep rolling downhill. That they tear out the bedrock is so shallow, the soil's so shallow that gravity just causes them to keep moving, and they keep growing up and they catch more debris. You can also go through and thin with pruners and make wattles, you know, brush piles, linear brush piles to catch organic matter. And you know, my property in Alaska, seriously, it's steeper than 45-degree angle. And the only flat land on that property we built by taking the branches from trees that we had cut either to build the house or to cut for firewood, and would always lay the brush and the branches crosswise between other trees to catch leaves and organic matter to start this little decomposition, a little soil mini compost pile. So you may want to build it with wattles above grade. You can do it with vegetation. A lot of places, I know in Haiti, we've done a lot with making swales by planting vetiver and other tall grasses that can help to catch the soil. Anything to catch additional soil, make a flat spot, soak some water in, slow down nutrient leaching. That's some of the benefits of pit and mound. Willows, alders, all work perfectly well on steep sites, possibly in your location.
Awesome. I'm going to let Mark go, guys. There are a couple more questions here that he didn't get to. We're going to get to them. I'll make sure he has them for next week. If you can, come and see tomorrow. There were a couple other really cool comments, Mark. They were telling thank you. And Sue just said thanks for those suggestions. So we're going to call it a night, and we've gone almost an hour and a half here. Marty asked about seeing it again. There is recordings if you're a member of the EAT team, and so we'll help you deal with that. So anyway, thanks, Mark, and we'll see you again tomorrow. And thank you, everybody, for being here. Great session, and we'll for sure see you all next week and hopefully tomorrow also. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.